All right, welcome everyone to Tahoe Silicon Mountain's Mountain Mines Monday. Today's topic, the Forlorn Hope Expedition, Donner Party Rescue Reprise. Mountain Mines Monday is a program of Tahoe Silicon Mountain. We're a 10-year-old nonprofit here in the Truckee, Tahoe area. We generally conduct 2 monthly events. Mountain Mines Monday is our flagship speaker series, the second Monday of the month, occurring virtually as you're joining us today. You can always find us on our YouTube channel. We also hold First Friday at 4. First Friday at 4 is an entrepreneurs roundtable, which is on hiatus while we're under the stay-at-home order. I'd like to give you a preview of what's coming up next month. Next month's topic is How Smart Are the Sierra Birds? Spatial Cognition and Natural Selection in Sierra Chickadees. And that presentation, always the second Monday of the month. So February 8th is the February Mountain Mines Monday. We hope you'll join us. In order to be informed about the upcoming events, please do sign up for our email newsletter. We only send a couple of notes per month, and that's just letting you know what the topic is that's coming up. You can also join us on Facebook, where you can engage with the rest of the community. And we do encourage you to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Not only will it allow you to participate live as you're doing today, but it will also allow you to peruse past presentations that we've had for Mountain Mines Monday. We do ask for a suggested donation of $5. The best way to do that is if you go to TahoeSiliconMountain.com. In the upper right corner is a yellow donate button. And you can go ahead and set up either a one-time or a recurring donation to Tahoe Silicon Mountain. And there are several expenses that we have even when we're virtual in terms of bookkeeping and tax filing, since we are a nonprofit, tax subscriptions, social media support, and live stream coordination. We're a 100% volunteer board. These are pictures of the 5 of us right now, but we're always looking for more volunteers to join our board. Please reach out if you have interest. We'd like to thank our generous sponsors that helped make this happen. For many years, our gold sponsor has been Holland and Hart Law Firm here in town. And our silver sponsors are Mobo Law Firm and a name you may have seen through communications about this event, and that's Bare Knuckle Branding. They've come on board as a silver sponsor for 2021. So thank you to Bare Knuckle. We'll probably be hearing from them later in the year. And we have quite a few community partners: the Nevada County Tech Connection, Tahoe Truckee Media, the Truckee Tahoe Airport, Lyft Workspace, where we host First Friday at 4 when we're back to meeting in person, the Truckee Chamber of Commerce, and Tahoe Donner, where we host Mountain Mines Monday when we're back to meeting in person. You too can be a sponsor. If you go to the bit.ly/sponsor MMM, that will tell you about the different sponsorship levels if you'd like to join as a sponsor or send an email. So I'm going to move on to the main event, the Forlorn Hope Expedition Donner Party Rescue Reprise. I'd like to direct you to the bottom of the screen. It says, if you have questions, you can email them to me, ellen@TahoeSiliconMountain.com, or ask in the YouTube comments, and I'll make sure that the questions get asked of our speakers. So I'd like to introduce our moderator for this evening. We have Frank Mullen is a Reno journalist, author, historian, and living history Chautauqua scholar. He's been a newspaper man for 40 years, including 25 as an editor and investigative reporter at the Reno Gazette-Journal. He's author of the Donner Party Chronicles and has appeared on the History Channel, Science, PBS, and other networks. He also has been an adjunct instructor of journalism and history at UNR and Truckee Meadows Community College in Reno. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Frank to introduce our speakers. Frank? Frank, I think you're on mute.
I love Zoom. I don't think when Bob Crowley started researching the desperate journey of the Forlorn Hope Party 7 years ago, he had any idea he was going, he and the team were going to recreate that trek, but he did. And I'd like to introduce you to Bob Crowley. Bob's on mute too.
There we go. Thanks, Frank. Real honor to be here amongst this esteemed group, and given a few of us have, in fact, I think all of us in one way or another have a tech background, it's going to be great, and love having Frank here. We're really honored to have him host and moderate this tonight. It's a big deal for us. Anybody that follows the Donner Party knows Frank's name and knows he is one of the regarded world scholars. So thanks, Frank, for being here tonight. I'm Bob Crowley, one of the members of the Forlorn Hope Expedition. My day job is in tech. I grew up in working both in Boston and the Silicon Valley in tech as an entrepreneur for most of my career, and now I joined the dark side and I do investing. So I'm on that side. And the night job is with this esteemed group that I'll introduce, doing historical research and then trying to bring history alive. And so with that, let me introduce, what I'll do is I'll introduce one person and they can introduce the next. So I'll introduce Tim Twietmeyer down there and let him tell you about himself, and then he can introduce the next member.
Good evening, everyone. My name's Tim Twietmeyer. I actually live in Auburn, California, down here a little ways down from the Tahoe area, but I also have a cabin in Serene Lakes, which is part of the tide to this whole story and how it got started. But I've been a distance runner, ultra runner most of my adult life. Didn't run when I was younger, but picked it up as an alternative to work and play. And I've spent about 40 plus years doing that, marathoning and ultra marathoning. And obviously the reason I live in Auburn is because there are so many nice trails to explore here, and I get to go out every evening. My house is literally 200 yards from the state park, which allows me to go 150 miles to Carson City or 50 miles to Sacramento on trail any night of the week if I can get that far. My day job is I work as like Bob said, I'm into tech as well. I manage a team of engineers at Hewlett Packard Enterprise in Roseville. And so I'm not too far from home to get down to work, but glad everybody joined this evening. Should be fun. And let me turn it over to my other Auburn resident friend, Elke Reimer.
Tim, just as Tim said, I'm Elke Reimer, another resident here in Auburn. I've lived in this area since 1976, and it's perfect to be involved in this expedition because of the history of living here for so long. I live right on the canyon here along American River, similar to Tim. And I've been active in the outdoors since my kids were old enough that I could escape on my own. And that's my dog Lupin, by the way. Anyway, I've been running ultras since my 40s. So, I don't know, 10 or 13 years or whatever you want to add that up to be. And let's see, I work for a local tech company. It's a fintech company called Riskalyze, and I'm an onboarding manager with them. So that allows me to work from home with all of this, and permanently too. So allows me to explore the trails a little bit more. I do a lot of backcountry work year round. With regards to exploring, I'm actually getting ready to start the Tahoe Rim Trail for a winter trip, just in sections, but doing the expedition certainly warmed me up for that, or cooled me down, whichever way you want to put it. So looking forward to talking with everyone tonight. And I'll pass it off to Jennifer Hemmen.
Hello, I'm Jennifer Hemmen, and I live in Fair Oaks, same as Bob. So we just live a little downstream from each other. And I was born and raised also Bob's other place in Boston, Massachusetts. So I grew up snowshoeing in the White Mountains of New Hampshire ever since I was a young girl, and grew up playing hockey and loving the outdoors. I moved to California 22 years ago. I live here with my husband and 3 kids, and I have a small business in environmental permitting, wetlands, endangered species, and this sort of thing. I am also a runner. I've been running since I was 12. Mostly, I've been a cross-country runner and a trail runner all my life, done my share of road marathons, paced for CIM like Tim, but my love is being in the mountains. So I'm an adventure racer. I do Eco Challenge and similar races like that involve mountain biking. But this was the perfect expedition for me because I love snowshoeing. It's my first love. I love winter and I love the mountains. So I was so honored to be part of it. And I feel like California is, even though I lived all over America, Texas, Montana, New Hampshire, Maine, I've lived in California the longest of any place, and it means so much to me to get to know this story. It's really been a remarkable journey, and I'll never forget our first Forlorn Hope expedition. So thank you, Bob and Tim, for coming up with such a great pastime, historical trail trekking. And with that, I'll turn it over to, I think, back to Frank. I think you're on mute, Frank. I'm not sure.
Okay.
There he is.
And a synopsis of the Donner Party, perhaps? Is that what?
Yeah, I thought maybe, Frank, what we do is a little context, and you'd be a perfect person to do that.
Sure.
So,
Okay.
Who's the Donner Party, and how did they end up in the fix they were in, and then how did this Forlorn Hope kind of come about?
Okay. Well, the short version is in the spring of 1846, a group of families, which was the nucleus of the Donner Party, crossed the Missouri River in a wagon train bound for California. Everything west of Missouri was Indian country, unsettled except for a few trading posts until you got to California, and that was Mexican territory. As a matter of fact, the entire American Southwest, as we know it today, was Mexican territory. They were looking for a better life in California, and there was, the year before, a term had been coined called manifest destiny, which was a very jingoistic kind of thing. It meant that it was God himself who wanted the United States to reach from one ocean to the other. And people had been going to Oregon since the 1830s with wagons. But in the early 1840s, they started heading for California, Mexican territory, with wagons as well. And so the Donners set off in the spring of 1846. And they didn't really become the Donner Party until they got to the west side of the Rocky Mountains, west side of South Pass. And they had heard about a shortcut that was supposed to cut 300 miles and weeks of travel off their journey. And so they wanted to take it. The people that became the Donner Party wanted to take it because they figured they could get to California earlier than the other parties on the trail that year. There were about 1,500 people on the trail that year. And they would get the best land from the Mexican land grants. And so they took a vote, and that's how the Donner Party was formed. The people that wanted to take this shortcut, the families who wanted to take it, became the Donner Party. There were about 87 people involved at the beginning of that shortcut, which was through what we now know as Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, and eventually crossing into the Sierra Nevada on the way to California. It wasn't a shortcut at all. It was a long cut, a long trip, as one of the parties on that trail said. It actually added 125 miles and several weeks of travel to their journey. By the time they got to what is now Reno in Nevada, they were down to 81 people. Some had died on the way, various causes. And they were the last party, the hindmost party in the immigration of 1846. It was it was the last week of October. They started going up into the Sierra. There was snow covering the Sierra. They went up the trail and it was snowing. But when they got to what is now Donner Lake, the snow had stopped, and their their guide, Charles Stanton, who had been to California and back, said, let's go over the pass now. And they said, no, Mr. Stanton. They built a fire and they said, we'll wait till tomorrow. And that night it began to snow. And a series of storms had pinned them in place from October 31st. Actually, the last survivor got off more than 4 months later, but they were trapped up there. And by December, they were seriously starving. Several people had died. And 17 of the people who could still manage to be fairly, to be athletic at all, the strongest ones, made a break for safety during a break in the weather on hastily made snowshoes. 2 of those people came back right away after one day, but 15 of them kept going on. Their guide, Charles Stanton, who knew the way, a few days into it, had gone snowblind and basically was left behind. He had sat on a stump and told them he would catch up to them, and he never did. And so now they were blind, not blind like Stanton, but blind to the route. They got lost in the maze of canyons and terrain along the American River, and they thought they were maybe a week away from Sutter's Fort in California, where there were settlements. Johnson's Ranch was the name of the closest settlement in Bear Valley, and they took a wrong turn and wound up taking more than a month to get there. Of the 15 snowshoers, only 7 survived. 15 started out. There were 10 men and 5 women. When they arrived at finally at Sutter's Fort, there were only 7 survivors. All 5 women and just 2 of the men had survived. And they became known as the Forlorn Hope Party by later writers. They didn't call themselves that, but their desperate dash for safety is a big part of the Donner Party that's often forgotten because of the cannibalism that took place in the story. That's always often the focus of it. But the Forlorn Hope is a survival tale within a survival tale.
Frank, maybe we'll pass it back to Bob and continue the research leading up to this expedition.
Yep. Thanks, Helen. Thanks, Frank. That was great. But I was sitting there having a whiskey listening to that. I could listen to that all night. So here we are. And how did we get here? So Tim and I, about 7 years ago, looking for something new to do, thought, wouldn't it be great if we could find this trail that's in our backyard? There's got to be a map somewhere, and go do it. Go do it for fun. 100 miles, maybe we'll do it in the winter, just like they did. It'd be kicks and giggles 7 years ago. And that's the genesis of it. And then we realized pretty quickly, there's no map. In fact, not only is there no map, there doesn't seem to be anybody that knows where they went because they got lost, as Frank said. So only pieces of the beginning of what they took were the traditional overland trail at that time. As soon as they got lost, for 3 reasons, no one knew where they went. One is the survivors didn't want to talk about it, and we'll get into why. 2, since they were lost and they were starving most of the time and in distress, no one was taking notes. And lastly, where they went was some of the most wild and wilderness parts of all of California, if not the West. So the combination of those 3 things made it an interesting challenge for Tim and I to decide, do we really want to do this? Because all of a sudden it went from just finding a map and going and doing it to we're going to have to piece a map together. And is that even possible? And little did we know, as we thought, well, let's do it. It sounds like fun. We aren't researchers, and we certainly aren't academics, and we don't have anywhere near the kind of qualifications that Frank has. So a couple of guys that just kind of backed into it said, well, let's start reading books. And 7 years ago, that's what we started. And I think we're up to 45, 50 books later, and journals and diaries and interviews and newspaper articles and everything you could possibly imagine. And along the way, our focus went from just finding the trail to actually becoming enamored with the people of the Forlorn Hope. And one of the questions I know on chat is, most people think of the Donner Party as a tragedy, and of course associate it with cannibalism. Our read on it was completely different. These people are amazing. In fact, it's stunning what they endured on behalf of their family and friends to try to get help, and how we continue to ask ourselves, how did they do it? How did they possibly survive 33 days with 6 days of rations at about 600 calories per person through a 100-year snowstorm on homemade snowshoes, starved 4 times, lost, and each day get up and somehow put one foot in front of the other and ultimately find their way to Johnson's Ranch near Wheatland? It's a stunning story. It's a story of really American legends, not tragedy. And of course, along the way there is tragedy, and we'll talk about that. But that's our story, is how we got enamored with it. And of course, as we went on, then we said we not only want to do the expedition, but we want to do it in honor of these magnificent people. And the first thing we've got to do is we've got to find some women to join us, because this is a lot about women. It's 5 women that survived. All the women survived, only 2 of the men. And so thankfully, we found 2 very gifted and talented women locally. And so we made the foursome. And at that point, we had to decide, well, what are we going to need? And I'm going to ask Ellen to advance to the next slide. And I'm going to have Elke take this one on. I'm going to kind of divide these up amongst us. So the next slide is a, kind of a picture of the kind of gear that we had to bring with us. And it took us a while to figure out, with a winter crossing, what exactly is it that we need to have on our backs and have on our feet, and we're going to use at night. So I'll let Elke take you through. This is one of several pictures of the things we packed, but it's a good example of the kinds of things that we used.
Great, thank you. Well, the whole key to winter expeditions is obviously warmth, right? And how do you achieve warmth in the winter but layering? For anyone in the audience who's ever done any winter treks, you start off with a base layer, and you can see in this photo here the base layers that someone on an expedition might wear. In other words, something like a wool base layer or an exoskin, which is more of a synthetic. I think it has a little bit of copper in it as well, so that whatever's next to your skin is giving you that base layer of warmth. On top of that, you have a mid layer that might be something like a windbreaker or what have you. And then you've got an outer layer as well. That way you can start out with all your layers on, and as you warm up, you shed some of your layers. On the feet, really important to have good foot care systems in place. And I learned that personally because I had a very bad blister from snowshoeing. And that was just from doing a little bit of warm up the weekend before. So I started out with a pretty bad heel blister, but having base layers with socks as well, just a real thin layer of socks, as well as sort of a mid layer of socks, and then your footwear, which is going to usually be waterproof. And then you've got the snowshoes there as well. And then keeping your head warm is very, very important. A lot of heat escapes through the head and the extremities as well. So layering your gloves. And as Stanton would tell you, being snowblind is definitely not the way to go. So having good eyewear as well to help you with that snow.
Great, thanks, Elke. And next slide, what we thought we'd do is take you on a little bit of the journey. So where did we go from and to, and what did we see along the way? And I'll ask Tim to provide a little commentary on some of the highlights of the trek itself, which was for us about a little over 100 miles.
Yeah, so obviously the Donner Lake got its name from the Donner Party, and that's where they were stuck. They couldn't get over the pass. They spent 6 weeks there from the end of October to the middle of December, agonizing over how to get to Johnson Ranch, which is at the bottom left-hand corner. Johnson's Ranch is kind of a hard thing to find today. You'll find signs in Wheatland and out on the road, but the actual ranch itself is a fairly nondescript little plot of land on a ranch right along the Bear River. And if you walked right by it, you'd never know it, other than there's a little wooden sign tacked in a meadow or a pasture that says Johnson's Ranch. They're in the process of trying to protect that area and bring it back to life as the end of the Overland Immigrant Trail. That's about approximately 100 miles. Obviously the key for those hikes, folks, was getting over Donner Pass, and the key to that was Franklin Graves's and Charles Stanton's snowshoes. They'd made it over the pass a few times and had to retreat due to the heavy snow, and it just became too hard for both, whether when they went with the mules they had to turn around, or the people were just getting too exhausted walking through the snow, and they didn't have snowshoes in those original chances over or runs over the pass, and had to retreat. But when they left on December 16th, they'd crafted 15 pairs of snowshoes for those that went on, and were able to get over the pass. From there, you travel through Summit Valley, or what's today Van Norden Meadow, across Soda Springs Road and out into the Royal Gorge Ski Resort, cross-country ski resort, what would be down the maintenance road and out towards Cascade Lakes. As you get through there, you obviously have a nice view of Devil's Peak, and the actual trail went right towards the shoulder, over the shoulder of Devil's Peak, and then out towards I-80. Once you got back down near I-80, just near what would be today Kingvale, a little bit west of Kingvale, that's the area that the Yuba River flows through, and the immigrants followed the river through that area. It pretty much follows the highway, and that's where Charles Stanton died, along what they called then the Yuba Bottoms. And he had made it a few days, but between snow blindness and just exhaustion, he couldn't keep up, and told everyone to go ahead, and then he quietly passed away in near a tree stump, and they found him later on. If you follow I-80 all the way out to just about Emigrant Gap, you kind of follow the same path that the immigrants did, just on the south side of the freeway, through Yuba Gap, through a place called 6 Mile Valley, which is actually sounds really pretty and cool, but when we went through there, it was full of whitethorn and snow. And so, yeah, of all the places we thought was going to be really, really cool to go through, it probably, for what we thought it would be and how miserable it was the most surprising. Bob and I had scouted that earlier on when there's plenty of snow and didn't have to fight any of the whitethorn. The most critical place for this group was when they got to a place near Lang Road, which is one of the off-ramps of the freeway, or a place that's famously known now for us as Wrong Turn. This is where they made their fateful mistake in the snowstorm, with Stanton now gone, who was the only person who knew the way. The two Indian guides or two Indian helpers that he'd brought back from Sutter's Fort really didn't know the way. And all they really needed to do was make a little half-mile climb north over what would be today Interstate 80, but it's just obscured enough, and the Bear Valley would be just down below that little ridge, and then they were home free, because they would have dropped into Bear Valley, and the Bear River and Bear Valley flows all the way to Johnson's Ranch. The Bear River is literally maybe a couple hundred yards now just south of Johnson's Ranch. So if they would have found their way into that trough, they would have made it no problem. But they were confused. They were starting to stress from not having enough food, and they made the wrong turn. And rather than making what would have been a north turn and getting over what would be today I-80, they turned southwest and started down into what is the North Fork of the American River, which is one of the steepest areas. That's certainly one of the steepest areas I've ever been in hiking. And so they started down that way, and then got stuck in a really tough set of weather at a place that now became known as the Camp of Death. After Stanton had passed back at Yuba Bottoms, they got to the Camp of Death and got stuck in a snowstorm. And this is where 4 of the men passed. For Franklin Graves, the young Lemuel Murphy, who was the youngest person on the expedition, 12 years old. Antonio, who was a cattle handler for the group, and then Patrick Dolan. And they were stuck there for several days. And in that time, when they had to go on, they decided to cannibalize those guys to continue on the way they were already out of food, now just less than 10 days into their trek. From there, they had to go down to the American River, and along that ridge, it's not quite shown here on the map, but a place called Sawtooth Ridge, they had to travel along there. And there's this very obvious place on Sawtooth Ridge where you can see right down the river and into the Sacramento Valley and out to the coastal mountains, which be, the East Bay Mountains that obscure the view of the coast. And they talk about that in the books of there's this place where they finally made it out of Camp Death Rolla and they could see the valley. And was really kind of a morale builder for them, that they knew where they were going now. But they still had to get across the North Fork of the American River, where they were going is one of the steepest areas there is. So they crossed the river and headed up on the other side, the south side of the river, into an area near Iowa Hill, followed the ridge down, and then had to cross the river one more time after the deer hunt note there, where they found a deer and were able to kill and butcher that and eat it. They crossed back over the North Fork of the American River near Colfax. We used a trail called the Stevens Trail, which is historical, is over 170 years old. And from there, they were now back into what would be where there were actually some other humans around, mostly Indians and other immigrants, where they would have used the trail, which crosses just north of Colfax. And when they got back into the Colfax area, they were able to find their way through Maidu villages. They found some Indians, and they were able to be assisted by the Indians, where they took them the last 30 or 40 miles from Colfax, or just below Colfax, and shepherded them down through the Maidu villages that would have been along the Bear River, to finally find their way to Johnson's Ranch, like I said, which is just a little bit east of today's modern day Wheatland and Highway 65. So the whole distance there is about 100 miles from the lake to Johnson's Ranch.
Thanks, Tim. That's incredible summary. So I'm going to ask Ellen to skip to slide 13. You can just advance them forward. And I'm going to ask Jen to comment. So the title of the slide, Jen, is Ordinary People Doing Extraordinary Things, something that you've spoken about a lot. So I'm going to ask you to tell everybody what we mean by that. I think you're on mute, Jen.
You're mute, Jen. There you go.
I didn't say anything important anyhow. Just I'm glad I was here. Well, so my takeaway from learning about the Forlorn Hope is that, one, what's remarkable is that, myself included, no one really knows this story, and it has not been widely told. I don't believe that even people who are California natives know anything about this. School children don't know about this. It's news to a lot of people. And what's remarkable to me is that I see it as a story of inspiration for myself when I'm going through a hard time. Ultra runners and endurance athletes, we're always looking for people we can turn to as mentors, and thinking about things like Elke and I talked a lot about what kind of things did they know to make this journey possible? What are the tricks and the tips that allowed these young women, these 17, age 19, 21, 22, these young mothers, these daughters, what allowed them to keep going in the face of every single adversity you can imagine: hunger, cold, fear, grief, and the thought that their children were just back at the lake, or their mothers or their siblings were back at the lake starving to death. That's overwhelming for anyone. And as Tim has pointed out, none of these people signed up for this. They signed up for a beautiful, scenic ride across America. They were wealthy families. You didn't go across America if you weren't wealthy. And they brought all their money and all their worldly goods with them. And they had sing-alongs and picnics and sitting by the fire at night and campfires. Suddenly, through a series of bad choices, they find themselves last in line to get over the Sierras. And instead of having this wonderful social time and this push into the promised land, they are faced with two bad choices: to stay at a lake and die, or if they were strong, to be asked to go over this pass and most likely die. So they had no good choices at all. And I just think it's so inspirational that they didn't give up, every last one of them, in the face of what they faced. So these weren't people who asked you this. They weren't on some sort of, macho hike. This wasn't their goal to go cross America in the hardest way possible. this is what they were faced with. And because some of them had young children, as young as 1 and under, still breastfeeding, back at the camps with other women, and because they had maybe a young husband that they were trying to get across to California, or because they had mothers and fathers who thought this was going to be a new life for them, and were back at the lakes, they kept going forward into the North Fork, even seeing Sacramento from 80 more miles of straight up and down into freezing cold canyons. They kept going. They had to watch their family members be eaten and used for food. They had to watch murder happen. And then they had to also partake of that food. And they just kept going because they wanted to save their families. So I use this as inspiration for when I'm having a hard time during COVID. I think, I can do this. If the Forlorn Hope can do it, if those young girls can do this, I can do anything as well. And that's a very valuable lesson for anybody in America today and around the world. And I think it's one of the reasons the Donner Party is so famous, is because they did come up against something difficult, but people only think of the cannibalism. But this is a story that could inspire anyone to do something physically and mentally hard if you love someone else, or you love your country, or you love, say, someone you just met, the way Charles Stanton gave his life for people he wasn't even related to. It's an inspirational story. So I hope that comes across, that they didn't sign up for this, and they had 2 bad choices, and they did a hard thing. And they weren't, their story was not told correctly. So I hope we've corrected that for them.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, so I think Jen captures well the spirit of why we were so intrigued with studying the Forlorn Hope and then ultimately honoring them. I'm going to throw the juxtaposition, if we go to the next slide, which is indeed, Donner Party, of course, is also associated with tragedy, and many of the historical accounts include that as part of the narrative, along with the cannibalism. And for Forlorn Hope, as Frank said, 17 actually started out, but 2 turned back right away. 15 travelers, only 7 survived. So what happened to the other 8? Well, we know Charles Stanton passed. We told that story. And then next to go were 4 in a span of 24 hours. Franklin Graves, the elder of the group, 57 years old, from Vermont. Antonio, who was a sheep herder and cattleman, teamster. Patrick Dolan, a bachelor, and Lemuel Murphy, who was 12 years old, all perished at a place now known as Camp of Death. On Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, 24 hours, 4 perished after Stanton. And then Jay Fosdick, he was a newlywed, married to his wife, Sarah Graves, who was on the trip with him. He died in her lap over on the Forest Hillside. And then ultimately, the last 2 to perish were Luis and Salvador, 2 Miwok Indians who had been pressed into service by John Sutter himself and ultimately became guides. And they accompanied Charles Stanton from Sutter's Fort back to meet up with the Donner Party with provisions. And they indeed did turn around with Charles Stanton and were essentially co-leaders with him to lead the Forlorn Hope to Johnson's Ranch and ultimately Sutter Fort. They were young. Some report them as young as 18. Other reports, one of them may have been 28, but they were young men who had not seen the trek from the west or from the east to the west. They'd only seen it with Stanton once, and it was from the west to the east with much less snow. And they weren't asked to guide there. Stanton was really doing most of the leading. So when Charles Stanton perished, these 2 young men were pushed into service to have to lead this remaining group of people. And they barely spoke any English at all. So we don't know what was said between Stanton and Luis and Salvador. It was probably a lot of sign language. But ultimately, they became the de facto leaders, along with a guy named William Eddy. And along the way, as people began to perish, Luis and Salvador chose not to partake in eating the human flesh as part of it being taboo in their culture. And they sustained that position deep into the trip until they had to, they were forced to, with no other choice, but to partake in the cannibalism along with everyone else. And then, as things got rough, the rest of the members began to turn their attention to these two young Indian men and wonder, maybe they should be the next to go. So Eddie, being a thoughtful and generous man, tipped them to the fact that there was some discussion about possibly using them for sustenance, and they escaped. They left and went ahead, and everyone at that point thought that was the last they'd see of them. But unfortunately, they didn't have enough fuel. They ultimately made it to somewhere along the Bear River and just dragged themselves to a stream. And as the rest of the party caught up, they saw the bloody footprints, which ultimately led them nearby to where they were. And then a scuffle occurred between a guy named Foster and William Eddy. And ultimately, Foster won the day and went, and as reports go, took his pistol and one bullet to each of the poor young boys' heads. In his opinion, putting them out of their misery. Others would report it as outright murder. And it would have been, if it was murder, the first murder and the only murder, it'd be the first within the Donner Party for the purpose of providing sustenance. So a very controversial part of the Donner Party story and the Forlorn Hope story. And what makes it even more controversial is that soon thereafter, the remaining 7 members of the Forlorn Hope Party came upon footprints over on the Colfax side along the Bear River, followed them to a settlement, and it was a Nisenan Indian settlement, which is a subgroup of the Maidu Indian. They were provided sustenance and guides, and from that point on, they were guided from settlement to settlement all the way to Johnson's Ranch. So the Nisenan Indians played a critical role in effectively saving the lives of the remaining 7 Forlorn Hope members. And if the Forlorn Hope members had not made it to Johnson's Ranch, speculation is that probably half, if not more, of the remaining people at the lake would have perished. So this is a big deal. And as the narrative goes, it's been by most people thought to be relatively ignored or brushed over, that there was this incident. And I thought I'd bring it up. And then I thought maybe Frank might have a perspective on this as to what history says.
Yes, you're right. It has been sort of brushed off over the years. It's mentioned in a lot of Donner Party narratives, but not really given the attention it deserves in terms of the relationship of Luis of Salvador to the party and what happened to them. And I think probably the author who had come closest to really doing a lot more in terms of researching the Indians was Winter of Entrapment. That book, he was the one who I believe he found their records in Mission San Jose that matched the ages and the identities of Luis and Salvador. Even came up with their real names. But yeah, I think it doesn't really get a lot of attention and didn't basically because of the Eurocentric attitudes of a lot of the early authors. And actually the murders of Luis and Salvador didn't get a lot of attention at the time. They were vaqueros, cowboys for Captain Sutter. He was the one who lent them to Stanton to take with the mules to bring some relief to the Donners before it was known they were entrapped. And when Stanton learned that they were dead, he just said, "Oh, my poor good boys." And that was the end of it. At the time in California, and there certainly thereafter in the gold rush, Indians had no rights. They were enslaved to work gold mines. They would run off their own villages in order for people to prospect and mine and do even just to do placer mining of gold in a creek. They would run off a whole village and kill people just to have a chance to pan for gold. And so there was a lot of prejudice and racism involved back then, and I think a lot of that carried forward in that the Luis and Salvador story didn't get a lot of attention, I don't think, until probably late in the 20th century.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. Much more, and certainly it's an area that we intend to continue to dig into as we've finished the expedition, but certainly not finished the research. So, King was the author Frank referred to that provided probably the most in-depth analysis as a Donner scholar, if you will, to date. But that was many years ago, as Frank said. There's not been much. So. It's a to-do on our list. I think what I'd like to do is skip to the 16th slide now, Ellen. And the last thing before questions is, so this thing that we started out by wanting to just simply go out on a trail and go do it ourselves. And then it turned into a research project. And then it turned into a fascination with the people and the feat that they accomplished. And along the way, we learned an awful lot about history in our own backyard. And we realized that that's been going on for years, decades, people discovering trails and stories. And it can be treasure hunts or it can be history right in your own backyard, and getting out into the beautiful environment and testing it for yourself. So this idea of bringing history to life, live, where you study it and then you go find it and go do it. And we've coined it history trail trekking. And we hope to bring more stories ourselves to the world, but also want to encourage other people to go do it themselves. And so in the future, one of the things we hope to do is kind of flip our website, continue to have that be dedicated to Forlorn Hope and Donner Party, but also expand the footprint so that other stories like the Donner Party that exist around the world and people interested in doing what we did, we can share that in this day and age. It's so easy to do. So history trail trekking. We want to acknowledge Keith Sutter photography as well. We have something to the order that our tech friends will appreciate this, 8 terabyte of media that has been collected during his work and 2-3 other photographers who followed us with drones and embedded with us and endured some of the very steep hills and the whitethorn and the river crossings and the cold right along with us as wonderful photographers, wilderness photographers do. So we shared a little video, a little clip of that in the beginning, and more of that will start coming out as poor Keith has to go through all 8 terabyte of information and put it into some order. So that's being done, but we wanted to give a shout out to Keith and to Ethan Vosberg and Austin Twietmeyer for the wonderful work that they've done already. And we've started to share that on our Facebook and website, but much more is coming. So with that, I think, Frank, we're kind of into the Q&A.
Okay, great. We do have some questions. First of all, someone asks, they're from the East Coast and they had heard of the Donner Party. And I was surprised to read that because I grew up in the East Coast. It wasn't in our history books, although my dad did know about him. He was a very well-read guy when it came to history, but so I kind of knew about him before I moved west. But the questioner says that when he or she heard of the Donner Party back on the East Coast, it was kind of a story of failure and and stuff. But then when they moved to California, it seemed to be more of a heroic story and more of a positive kind of story. And would you guys, being from California, would you like to address that? What the attitudes were when, not just now, but when you were growing up? What did you think about the Donner Party as being a tale of failure or something else?
Let me suggest that we'll have Jen go first because she grew up in New Hampshire. So let's get the East Coast perspective, and then maybe Elke and Tim can give us growing up on the West Coast perspective.
Yeah, so I grew up. I born in Boston, Massachusetts, and then moved to New Hampshire, the White Mountains, when I was 12. So I never heard a thing about the Donner Party. I may have read about it in National Geo because I think we had over 300 copies of National Geographic in my house, and I read each and every one front to back. That was my very favorite reading material. So I had not heard of them, but as soon as I moved here in '98, I went straight to Tahoe and went up on Emigrant Gap. And I said to my then friend at the time, who's now my husband, I said, I want to hike the whole trail and I want to go exactly where they came over with the wagons. And that to me was the heroism, was that these pioneers, not just the Donner Party, but they'd gotten these wagons over these terrifically steep areas that they were just sort of guessing at what the best notches were to go through. And I actually wanted to bring a wagon and try to take it apart and do it because I couldn't understand. Nothing like that had ever happened in New England. All we had was rocks in our fields, but I'd never heard of anyone taking apart a wagon or hauling cattle over a hill. And that to me was the heroic part. And I knew they must have done something great for it to be the Donner Lake and the Donner Pass. But I basically just admired them for being stuck in a snowstorm and for them even trying this thing where they were going to have to take apart wagons and bring them over. But what's miraculous to me is that the Donners never saw Donner Lake. They never saw the places that we went to. They actually were 6 miles back in Alder Creek. And that's a part of the story I never knew, even living here for 20 years. So I did see them as heroes, but I really didn't hear that they were failures other than they had to eat each other. And that was very sensational. But I thought of them as heroes, along with all the other American pioneers. I didn't see them as bad people, but I did not know that they had done such an endurance feat as this. That was not known to me, even as an endurance athlete. So, Elke, probably
Sure.
You're Californian.
Yes, I'm Californian, and yeah, I absolutely see them as heroes. Not only just that story of survival for themselves, but also the story of survival for the people left behind, especially with the Forlorn Hope group. Their whole mission was to get help for those people left behind. Having lived in this area for so long, it's kind of interesting because as we were out on the trek, going through the various areas, especially through the North Fork, I pointed over and I said, gosh, I lived over there on the ridge line above Euchre Bar. You know, that's an area that we traveled through. We ended up going into Colfax. We went right past the street that my kids were raised on, went right past there. We continued down into Nevada County. I lived in Lake of the Pines. Pretty much along the way, everything except the beginning of it, I've lived there. So different areas had different names, and it all kind of tied in together as to whether the Forlorn Hope group had gone through there, whether the Donner Party had gone through there. I knew that it was an immigrant trail in many of the places. I also, in my adult life, did a lot of Nordic skiing at Royal Gorge, and a lot of the ski trails out there were named after the immigrants, or immigrant trail, various areas that the Donner Party had gone through too. So it's interesting how it all kind of ties together this way, but it's definitely a story of heroism, of enduring probably the most challenging thing we can ever even imagine. They endured on a daily basis. And yeah, it's absolutely not a story of failure, but a story of heroism. Tim?
Well, this is what hooked me on the story when I read In Different Stars Above by Daniel James Brown. Was, I've been around, I had that cabin up in Serene Lakes for years and years. And of course I'd been to Donner Lake and Donner Pass and all these places named Donner. It's just prevalent all through that area, but I never knew the story of the Forlorn Hope because I hadn't dug in that story deep enough to find out what they had done. And then when I read the book and realized these guys had hiked 100 miles in the middle of winter to save their families and get everyone back at the lake, the food and provisions they really needed, I was just fascinated by that because I live in Auburn and they went right through North Auburn on their way out to Johnson's Ranch, yet I really never knew that, as someone who lived here for 20 years. And I was just fascinated because as an outdoor person and somebody that spent a lot of time near Donner Lake and down here in Auburn, that once I tried to rationalize it and get into the heads of these people, I realized how an enormous physical feat it was to do that, and a mental feat as well, right, to make it that far. And that's what really hooked me on the story for sure. I saw it immediately when I saw the Forlorn Hope part. Those guys were the superheroes for sure.
Frank, we're almost at 6 o'clock, and I know you have several more audience questions. Maybe we can parcel them out for one person to answer each of the remaining questions. Frank, are you on mute?
One question is fairly brief to answer. The Forlorn Hope term itself comes a military term from the 17th century. Who was the first author to attach that to this group of escapees from the entrapment?
Well, what do you know? It was a Truckee guy, C.F. McClatchin. And he wrote a book, what was it, Frank, 1879-ish?
Yes.
The first book about the history of the Donner Party, where he did a remarkable thing. He said, I'm going to write the real story 20 some years later, and I'm going to do it by asking all the survivors if they'll let me interview them, and I'll tell their story. And it was in that book that came out. He was a Truckee journalist with a guy named Crowley, by the way, at the time. They were partners, and he wrote the book and coined the term, which, as Frank said, is a British term. And if you Google Forlorn Hope, you'll see it's still used today, and talking about sort of hopeless situations. And he felt that was an appropriate term for this, as Jen said, a hopeless situation where you stay at the lake, you die. You go on the Forlorn Hope, you die.
And I think it started out with the Dutch. They would have a squad that had that name in Dutch, that were like the tip of the spear. These were guys that went into the battle first. You knew they were going to die.
Yep.
And then the British picked it up as a kind of a nickname for anyone in a bad situation like that.
Frank, can I ask, like, what do you mean by the Dutch? How did that came from?
Netherlands.
Really? During times of war?
Yes. Yeah. In military, and it sounds like in Dutch, it sounds like Forlorn Hope. The term itself sounds like, and I don't know how to pronounce it. It was something like Forlorn Hope or something like that, and so that was picked up by the British.
Interesting. Okay.
Another question. What happened to those survivors, those 5 women and 2 men? Did they get along very well after that? They go on Oprah and tell their stories. What happened to them?
Tim, you want to take that one?
Well, it really depends on who you talk about. I know that, while we had our thing going on, some of the Graves kids, they lost all 3 of the youngest members of their family in the Forlorn Hope rescue. But Nancy was the youngest one at, I want to say, 9 years old when the group left. But Marianne and Sarah went on, but most of the people in those days didn't live very long, industrious lives. It was a pretty harsh, to go across the United States and then, go through the mountains and whatnot. So a lot of them live fairly short lives compared to what you would consider today. I don't know the exact on every one of those, Bob. You know that a little better than me, but some of them had fairly, not too much longer after they got through, and some of them were certainly haunted by the what they'd had to endure during the time of the trek, for sure.
Yeah, many did settle in the area, Napa or Sonoma or San Jose, in San Francisco area for sure. Some became politicians, lawyers, judges, police chiefs, school teachers, farmers, investors, land investors, some speculators, some dabbled in gold, Foster being one. So you had a little bit of everything, but the one thing that was in common is they did not want to have a reunion. They did not want to get back together again, and they never wanted to talk about this ever again. So once the initial interviews happened, soon after they arrived at Sutter's Fort, no one in the group wanted to talk about it.
Another question we have, and this pertains to the modern Forlorn Hope. How long did it take you to take this trip that took them 33 days? And also, how did you sleep? How often did you sleep during this expedition?
Elke or Jen?
I'll take it. Sure. It took us 5 days. So 4 nights, 5 days. And we did camp outside along the way. Night one was snowy, actually. It started snowing when we set up our camp, and it snowed on us most of the night. And we set out the next morning in the snow. That second day, it had snowed pretty much the entire day, and it was a pretty wet night where we camped. Yeah, all of our clothes were wet from the day going through 6 Mile Valley, etc. Yeah, so we camped out each night. Last night was the most interesting night of them all, because our plan A for where we were going to camp, not too far from Lake of the Pines, had fallen through, and we sat there at the corner of Highway 49 and Wolf Road without a place to camp. And a mutual friend of all of ours in the ultra running community basically, well, she didn't offer, but I asked her if it would be okay if we camped in their backyard in Lake of the Pines. So that was a really interesting night, and she kind of saved us that night. And we had a great time. We slept under the stars for that last night, and then finished our trek the very last day on day 5.
How many hours of sleep were you able to get on those nights?
I think for the most part, maybe not so much for Bob, but the rest of us got pretty decent nights of sleep.
It depended on how close you were to Bob and Tim's tent. How close were you to the snoring sounds? And I was so happy I had put earplugs in my sleeping bag, and I found those, and that helped me sleep.
It's one of the many things that's never documented in the Forlorn Hopes. All the awful things that happened to them was they snored too, So.
And they had to dry out their clothes for so many hours every night. It took us probably from 4 p.m. making the fire until, what do you think, 9 o'clock?
Yeah.
To dry our clothes out over the fire. And then even some things we left out all night over the fire while we went to bed. So they might have not gotten as much sleep as us, because they had no pop-up tent over their fire to dry their clothes by. So.
And they were wearing their clothes probably to sleep in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Frank, you want to ask one more question?
Well, this pertains not just to the Forlorn Hope, but the entire Donner Party. When they got stuck up there near Truckee, and they realized they couldn't get over the pass, why didn't they just turn around and go east and hit lower altitudes there and winter on the other side?
So since that's the last question, I'm going to throw it right back to the guy that asked it, because he knows better than any of us.
Yeah, we've had this discussion before.
And that is the number one question I get asked when I talk about the Donner Party, particularly locally, because people want to know, if they got up to Donner Pass in modern times, they couldn't get over the pass, they turn around, come back to Reno and get a motel. But in that case, they thought they were a few days, a week maybe, away from Sutter's Fort. They had been harassed by the Paiutes all the way across Nevada. not to kill them, but to steal their or to take their livestock. And so going east was danger, going west was just a few days to safety. And so they kept trying and trying to get over the pass. And by the time they realized there's no way they're going west, they couldn't go east either. They couldn't retrace their steps because the snow was so deep on both sides of the Sierra. And the way Mr. McClashen put it in his first history of the Donner Party was, by the time they realized the trap had closed in front of them, it had already snapped shut behind. I always love that sentence.
Yeah.
Great. Well, with that, I think we're going to have to wrap things up. We've closed out our hour. We're so excited to have had you participate with us as technologists. Many of the people that are part of our group are technologists, so it was great that you had technologists on your team. And so thank you all for participating. We do meet the second Monday of every month. We encourage you to sign up for our email list and subscribe to the YouTube channel so that you can join us next month. And if you haven't had a chance yet, we would love if you could make a small donation to Tahoe Silicon Mountain, who puts these events on, TahoeSiliconMountain.com, and a donate button in the upper right corner. So thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you next month.
Thank you, Ellen. It was great.
Thanks.
Good to
you
see
so much.
everybody.
Thanks, Frank.